everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you very much for attending this session. I know you have a lot of choices, and I've been speaking at Devnexus for, I don't know, almost 10 years now, and it's it's really sort of audience friendly to have all these options and then having to make a decision as to which session you're going to go to. So thank you for choosing this one. In terms of introductions, my name is Reza Rahman. You can see my title on screen. I'm Principal Program Manager for Java on Azure. What that means is basically I try to take care of all of our Java customers on our Azure platform. And basically, I'm going to talk to you essentially about my day job for the most part today. So we'll talk about why Microsoft has embraced Java in such a way, and what does that actually mean in terms of the services and products and tools and the like that we are offering for Java developers on the Azure platform primarily. Okay, so I think somebody asked a good question, like, is this the same company anymore? Like, what's going on here? And in fact, I'll be honest with you, 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know that I would have imagined I'd be delivering this talk, right? So to me, this is quite astounding to come to a Java conference and try to deliver this talk. And why is it? In a nutshell, it's because Java is as successful as it is, right? So here I have a graphic for you. There's many such data points that you can take a look at, but this is a particularly good one because I think it's really representative of what's happening, and also gives you a view of where all the technology trends sort of are going, at least in terms of languages. So this is a TOB programming index. If you haven't heard of it before, it's one of the better indexes in terms of programming languages. So what you will see is there are some clear sort of demarcations of what is happening in the language space. So there's all these sort of first-tier languages and second-tier languages. The first-tier languages are really the ones that are mainstream, right? The ones that if you're looking for a job as a new grad, this is the stuff you'd want to learn. So at the top of the end of this curve, you can see what the real winners have been for a long period of time now, and that is C and Java. So C, as we know, is not really about the C development footprint. It, for the most part, is not about enterprise development. This is all of the things that are happening in the embedded space and then the system development space. Primarily even Linux drivers, those are all C drivers at this point. But Java really, if you really look at it, what is happening, what this graph is telling you is that if you are an enterprise developer working in a large company or a medium-sized company, most likely you're developing your mission-critical applications in Java. And what you also see is that there's the second tier of languages, and this is where sort of the traditional Microsoft technologies are falling, right? So they're definitely, in terms of adoption margins, the adoption margin is quite high. So as you know, the reason this is all relevant is because Microsoft as a company is changing. So it's changing in 2 different ways. We're no longer so focused on Windows development anymore. Our focus is on Azure, right? So in order to be successful as a first-tier cloud provider, you really need to follow what is happening in this ecosystem. You can't sort of impose your own opinion on the people that are developing all these enterprise applications. So inevitably, what that means is we need to embrace Java. So that is fundamentally what is happening, and what is the driving motivation behind us making sure that we are a really good citizen of the Java ecosystem, and the Java developers are a good first-class citizen on Azure. And actually, this is not as new as you might think. So I'm very flattered that you're coming to my talk today. But believe me, this particular talk is actually about 5 years old. The original rendition of this talk is about 5 years old. Here's a gentleman that is going to be delivering another talk. His name is Brian Benz. This is from DevOps France 2015. Okay, so Java on Azure as a concern really has been there for a little while. It's been sort of subliminal at Microsoft ever since sort of Satya made that big announcement of we love Linux, which we'll get into in a bit. Java has basically been a part of the Azure platform since then. But really, Java on Azure has become a serious concern for about 5 years. And I genuinely believe, and I hope you will see it also, is in those 5 years we have actually bridged the gap, right? In my opinion, we're actually one of the best places to be running Java workloads in terms of top tier cloud providers, and we're also doing far beyond that. It's not just about Azure. Azure is the primary driving motivator, right? That's the reason why we would want you to embrace Azure, and why we would want to embrace you as developers. But as a side effect of that, we're also contributing to the ecosystem at large, right? First and foremost, by making sure that one of the premier cloud providers are actually supporting the Java language. right? And in fact, if you really look at Google and Amazon, I have to say, I don't think they're doing as good of a job of appealing to Java developers and doing things that really are meaningful to Java developers. And I think that alone is an important reason, right, why you should be looking at Microsoft differently. But even beyond that, we are also doing things at the ecosystem level as well, and we're going to be doing more of that as we go along. So before I move too far forward, there's a couple of different things I want to mention to you. I generally, in my talks, do not have dedicated time for Q&A. So this is what I prefer to do instead. If you have a question, please raise your hand right away. Okay, don't wait until the end of the session. I'll pause a little bit here and there, okay, to give you a chance to ask questions. But even then, you don't need to wait for my pause. You can simply raise your hand. I'll stop as quickly as I can, and let's do the Q&A as we go throughout in the hour that we have together. The other thing that I will mention to you is there is an incentive for you to ask a question. I hope this is not the reason you ask a question, but there is a bit of an incentive, okay? And you see it here, all right? So you have about, I think, $250 value here. This is a Surface headphone, pretty nice high quality headphone. It's not Bose, but it's pretty good. So if you ask me a really good question, okay, you can have at this, all right? But I will be the judge as to who wins though. So competition is on, it's on you now. All right, so there's many different pathways. The Java ecosystem, we know that the Java ecosystem is diverse, right? Java is not just one thing. Java has been around for almost 25, 30 years now. And as a result, it's a heterogeneous system, right? There's many different, when you talk about what is a Java developer, there's no one profile that you can fit. It's not a one size fits all. It's a diverse ecosystem. And similarly, there are diverse capabilities and complex capabilities geared towards particular sets of workloads on Azure. So what we are trying to do is essentially create a roadmap where you can get from point A to point B, wherever point A or point B might be. So you might be just a Java SE developer, perhaps only developing only on servlets, and that's about it. It's a rare case, but it does happen, and we have examples of that on Azure. It could be that you're a Spring developer, you're using Spring Boot or Spring Framework, or it could be that you are running Java EE or Jakarta EE, whether that's Quarkus or WebLogic or WebSphere. And believe it or not, we see all of the spectrum, all of these spectrum of technologies on Azure. Now, where do you go with that, right? So the primary four destinations, if you're to categorize it, are virtual machines, containers, managed services, and serverless, okay? And we'll talk a bit about each of these things. But think of this particular slide as sort of a roadmap for the rest of this talk, okay? So this is sort of our tour guide, if you will. So similar to the fact that we don't care about what kind of Java workloads you're running and what kind of platform you ultimately want to run it on, we also don't particularly care what your architecture is. Okay, our job is to enable you, no matter where you are in your architecture journey. You could be running a monolith, and lots of Azure customers are doing that. You could be running a containerized monolith, and there are capabilities that will help you do that. There are cases where you are breaking up perhaps your monolith, and you're going to probably in the longer term also live with a combination where you have a primary monolith that is supported by some number of microservices. You could be in the process of moving away from monolithic architectures and gradually re-architecting your application using the strangler pattern, namely breaking off as many chunks as you can from your monolith. Or you could be developing a net new microservices cloud native application where you have dozens or perhaps even hundreds of microservices, much like Netflix or Google. So whatever your architecture, our job is also to support you, okay? And wherever you may be in your architecture journey, it is our objective to support you. So let's now begin to talk about what the pathways to Azure is, and this is going to be the primary thrust of my talk today. So let's start with the very basics, and that is virtual machines. And believe it or not, virtual machines now are about a 15-year-old technology. Okay, so the originators of this was Sun Microsystems in all reality, but really who brought it in mainstream is, of course, our good friends at Amazon with EC2. But really, this is a very old technology. Fundamentally, if to use a cliche, this is your machine running on somebody else's data center. At the end of the day, the experience is very similar. Right? You're getting a virtual machine that happens to be running on Azure, but fundamentally your programming model is mostly the same. And believe it or not, while the share is declining, this is still the lion's share of where Azure revenue still comes from. So a majority of Azure customers still are in this virtual machine space. And the virtual machines is where the Java on Azure story actually starts. When Satya is referring to Microsoft loves Linux, what he's actually referring to is the fact that Microsoft Azure used to be one day called what? Anybody know what the original name of Microsoft Azure is? Anybody? This is a good question. It might win you 250 bucks. Okay, Windows Azure. Okay, that was the original name for Azure. But the fundamentals of Satya going out and saying, hey, we love Linux, really fundamentally what that means is at the virtual machine level, we not only support Windows, and that's where we renamed it from Microsoft Windows Azure to Microsoft Azure, okay? And in fact, we support a plethora of Linux virtual machines. So all of the major distributions are actually supported on Azure. I'll tell you that the most popular one is actually Red Hat Linux. Okay, that is by and large what we see in the enterprise in most cases. Now, while virtual machines is an old technology and it's very much similar to what you may be doing in your data center today, at the end of the day, you are still running on a cloud. Okay, so there's a lot of cloud capabilities that are baked into this old mature technology called virtual machines. One of the most important ones, and thus far not as well understood or well appreciated, is something called marketplace solution templates. So if you have used containers, so containers has the concept of images, right? So it's an image where you say, hey, I want Tomcat, and everything that entails is already bundled in that image. Marketplace solution templates are that plus a UI, right? So the ability to configure something in the way you want it. So let's say, for example, that you want to run Oracle WebLogic, and your end state is that you want to set up a n-node WebLogic cluster. Well, you can do that the hard way by spinning up virtual images and trying to do the OS install and the Java install and then the WebLogic install and setting up the WebLogic cluster. But you actually don't need to do any of that when you're on a platform like Azure, because all of that is abstracted through a UI. Okay, so you go into the marketplace solution templates, you select a template, and the template will take you through a wizard-like experience to say, hey, this is the version of WebLogic I want. This is the operating system I want. This is so many clusters I want. Please create a load balancer in front for me. All of that manual work that you used to do, even in virtual machines, all of that stuff goes away with marketplace solution templates. And we have a particularly strong marketplace solution template offering, especially geared towards Java developers, okay? So here is maybe a 15%, or maybe even less than that, a 5% snapshot of what you can do in terms of just available marketplace solution templates on Azure, okay? So you can see all of the things that are supported on Java SE, Zulu. There's a marketplace solution template for Zulu. There's one for OpenJDK. For Jakarta, we have all of the major runtimes, and we develop these particular marketplace solution templates in conjunction with the corresponding vendor. Okay, so we're working with Red Hat for JBoss EAP, Oracle for WebLogic, IBM for WebSphere Traditional. And when you go to the marketplace solution template and you search for, let's say, WebSphere, what you will see is that there's a set of marketplace solution templates, and the publisher will be IBM. Okay, so we're literally working with these companies to create these optimal experiences, even on virtual machines. Same story for databases, right? So all manners of relational databases are supported on VMs. All manners of messaging systems are supported as marketplace images, and all manners of DevOps capabilities. We'll talk about what the Azure native DevOps capability is in a moment, okay? But if you don't want to use that, well, you can spin up Jenkins, you can spin up Elasticsearch, you can spin up Splunk quite easily by going through those marketplace solution template solutions. So let's now switch gears a little bit away from this. Yes, sir. Absolutely. So remember that virtual machines are just one pathway. right? So you have multiple other pathways. Frankly speaking, when people are running infrastructure, so let's make a demarcation between your core runtime, where your application is running, let's say Tomcat or Spring Boot or WebSphere or WebLogic, and the rest of the things, right, that go around it that's infrastructure. There are absolutely legitimate cases where you would want to run those pieces of infrastructure, like the ones that are here, on virtual machines. For example, if you have very specialized configuration needs, okay, if you have very specialized licensing, okay, licensing schemes, those are all good reasons to be running these solution templates and using things like a MongoDB on virtual machines. But that is only one option, right? I will tell you the most popular option for infrastructure-related services like this are not virtual machines, also not containers, at least not yet. The most popular way of running these sorts of software on Azure is actually managed services, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So in terms of Mongo, frankly speaking, in the 80% use case, you wouldn't want to be doing virtual machines anyway, right? So what you would want to look at is some kind of managed service, and there's two options for Mongo in particular on Azure. One is obviously Azure native, which is Cosmos DB. I'll talk about that in a moment. Cosmos DB has a MongoDB interface, but that is the closest thing you can get in terms of an Azure native service that supports Mongo. So it's a really good choice, right? If you're an Azure customer and you want to use Mongo. If you don't want to use Cosmos DB for some reason, right? There's also another thing called Atlas. Okay, and Atlas is from MongoDB as a company, and it does the same thing. It gives you basically a managed experience. So a few different options, but virtual machines is simply one of them. Okay, so similar story for DevOps as I mentioned. Any other questions? No, we're all good? All right, let's keep moving. So next I want to talk to you about multi-cloud platforms. Okay, what are multi-cloud platforms in particular? Multi-cloud platforms are basically a technology set that is a cloud within a cloud. I'll tell you what I mean by that, right? So it's basically an environment where you can create much of the same things that you would do on a native cloud like AWS and Azure, but it's done in a way that is abstracted from the cloud platform. Okay, so OpenShift is a good example of this, and OpenShift folks have been doing this for a little while now, right? So if you want to spin up, an application server, you want to spin up a database and whatnot, you don't have to do that from an Azure interface. You can do that from the OpenShift interface, and the OpenShift interface, its virtue, one of the virtues, is that it can run anywhere, right? You could be running OpenShift on Azure. You could be running exactly the same interface, Rosa on AWS. You could be running it on-premise or some combination thereof, or somewhere in your journey, okay? So typically these multi-cloud platforms are based on containers. By and large today, it's the de facto container platform these days, as you probably all know, is Kubernetes, okay? So both of these multi-cloud platforms, the primary ones, are actually nothing much more than sort of abstractions over Kubernetes that you can run on multiple clouds, or you can run it on-premise. So two primary multi-cloud platforms worth talking about. One we already talked about, OpenShift. So we support OpenShift on Azure by providing a managed service. Now you can spin up something like OpenShift by yourself, but it is rather hard work. Okay, so instead of doing all of that, you basically point and click and get a managed service that you can run OpenShift. Lo and behold, you get OpenShift, and you can do whatever you want on OpenShift using Azure Red Hat OpenShift. The other primary leading multi-cloud platform is VMware Tanzu. Okay, so VMware Tanzu, we do not really have a managed service. We kind of sort of do. I'll mention that in a moment. But primarily, if you want to be running VMware Tanzu, there is a marketplace solution template that will allow you to do that and be able to do that on virtual machines. Also, there is another service called Spring Cloud Service that uses VMware Tanzu as an implementation layer. Okay, so there's two different ways where we support VMware Tanzu, but not directly as a managed service per se. Okay, but Azure Red Hat OpenShift, definitely a first-class managed service. It's not abstracted in any way. You're getting OpenShift basically on Azure. Okay, so of course we want to talk about the fastest growing part of where people land these days, and this is definitely the fastest growing portion of what we see on Azure, and that is containers. Okay, so this is probably does not come as any surprise to any one of you. If you want to be doing something a little bit more cloud native, but you're not really ready to go full PaaS or full managed service, this is a very good middle ground that also gives you that benefit of cloud neutrality. Okay, so if you target towards a container platform like Kubernetes, similar to OpenShift, the value proposition is exactly the same. You could be running the same Kubernetes interface on Azure, on AWS, or on-premise. It's the same thing. Now, obviously, we have wholeheartedly embraced Kubernetes ecosystem big time. All right, so we have one of the big 3 implementations of Kubernetes, namely Azure Kubernetes Service. So again, this is a managed service that allows you to get up and running with Kubernetes literally in a few clicks. In addition to that, we have some satellite services built around Azure Kubernetes Service. One of the key ones being Azure Container Registry. So typically, when you're deploying a Kubernetes application, you need to be using some kind of container registry. That could be Docker Hub, but not typically. Okay, the reason is a couple of reasons. Number one, you want your internal registries to be private. Okay, you don't want that to be public. You can create that in GitHub. But the issue is you're already paying money, right? You're already paying money to your Kubernetes provider. So it only makes sense that that same Kubernetes provider also gives you the registry services. Okay, so that is really what Azure Container Registry is, and it's very tightly integrated with AKS in a way that simply something like Docker Hub simply isn't. Now, another nice option that I will talk to you very briefly about is Azure Container Apps. Okay, so the reason this one is interesting is because it straddles a line between Kubernetes and just containers. Okay, so let's imagine a scenario where, so Kubernetes absolutely makes sense if you're developing a complex application that has multiple layers of orchestration, okay, or you need a fine-grained control at the orchestrator layer to be controlling your deployment. But let's say you don't need all of that, and really all you have is a single couple of units of an application that's broken up, like maybe 5 microservices that occasionally interact with each other and don't need very much orchestration. So in that case, the Kubernetes ecosystem is actually overkill for you. So all you really need is something that will let you create a Docker image and put that in a registry and take that Docker image and create a few instances of that deployment. Let's say 3, 5 instances of this application. So this is the problem space that Azure Container Apps, okay, lands upon. So this is what allows you to do that. You don't need to know Kubernetes. You don't need to know the internals of very much else other than how do you create a Docker image and how do you go to the Azure portal to say, hey, take this Docker image and create 5 instances of this thing for me. So that's what that is. So similar to what we have done for virtual machines, the same concept of marketplace solution templates actually is applicable to Kubernetes as well, right? So just like we are abstracting the provisioning part of virtual machines using marketplace solution templates, we can similarly also abstract the provisioning part of containers in the same abstraction, right? So we are actually applying the same concept of marketplace solution templates to Java workloads in particular, in fact. Okay, so we've started with basically the traditional app server, so WebSphere, WebLogic, JBoss, EAP. You can very easily get marketplace, search in the Azure portal, search for these app servers, and you'll see that there's options to run these either on AKS or ARO using the same marketplace solution template approach. So that takes away a lot of the complexities of where you would be stuck in terms of getting started in your containerization journey. So moving forward, if somebody were to ask me, okay, so all the stuff, AWS has it. Okay, so AWS has virtual machines, AWS has marketplace solution templates, AWS has a Kubernetes distribution, and I can run OpenShift in a managed way on AWS using Rosa. Fine. You know what makes Azure special that neither Google nor AWS has? The secret sauce is this. Okay. The secret sauce is managed services. We actually invest in managed services above and beyond simply supporting containers or virtual machines. Where we really truly shine and where we are miles ahead, okay, of the competition is around managed services. And that is a concept where you're on the cloud. The reason you got on the cloud is to get rid of your infrastructure concerns. So why would you want to bring back all of those infrastructure concerns back in again if the objective was to move away from it in the first place? Okay, so managed services is a concept that says, I don't care about deployment, I don't care about infrastructure, I just want to deploy my application and have all of that concerns as much as possible be handled by the runtime. Okay, so this is precisely what managed services shines at, and we have a number of managed services that are particularly pertinent to Java developers. Okay, so let's talk about a few of them. I'm going to leave one important one a little bit later, and that being Spring Cloud Service. But this is the, if you will, the mainline ones, the ones that have been established for a little while. Okay, so what are these? First and foremost is App Service. So App Service is basically the premier tier PaaS platform for Azure. Okay, so using App Service, you can simply treat your Java runtime as a managed concern. Okay, so if you're deploying to Java SE, you can simply say, hey, spin up so many instances of a JVM, let me deploy my jar there. That's it. I don't worry about anything else. All of the manageability and integration and upgrades, all of that is taken care of for me. Same thing with Tomcat. Okay, so you can spin up any number of Tomcat instances using Azure App Service. And interestingly and very uniquely, nobody else, none of the other top tier providers really are anywhere close to this. We also provide a full-fledged Java EE runtime for those Java EE workloads that you've been living with for 10 or 15 years. Okay, so you can very easily spin up app service on JBoss EAP. Okay. Now that's just the application portion, right? So as we talked about, PaaS applies actually much more strongly when you are talking about things that are beyond simply applications, when you're really talking about things that are infrastructure, truly infrastructure, okay, from the perspective of most development organizations. So these are things like databases, and we support a number of managed databases on Azure. You name it, we pretty much support it. SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MySQL, MariaDB. Really the only significant ones that we do not support yet is Oracle and DB2. But other than that, pretty much all of the databases are offered as managed services. Same thing for MongoDB, for NoSQL, okay? So Cosmos DB is just like App Service is a premier service for applications, Cosmos DB is a premier managed service for NoSQL databases, okay? So Cosmos DB has a very interesting architecture in that under the hood, it basically gives you the basic building blocks of what you need to build a database, okay? So what that means is that Cosmos DB can then expose multiple APIs. So the main APIs that it supports today are Mongo, okay, as we discussed before. Cassandra is another one. Gremlin, which is a graphing protocol, okay, and also simply name value pairs. Okay, so these are the different protocols that Cosmos DB supports in terms of all of your NoSQL offerings. Similarly, let's suppose you're doing just caching, okay, and it's just a name value pair that you are storing. One of the ones that are obviously incredibly popular is Redis. So we offer a managed Redis service. So you don't even have to run Redis on virtual machines or containers. You can just point and click and have a running instance of Redis on Azure. Same story with DevOps tools. Okay, so now let's talk about what is the premier DevOps platform for Azure. The premier DevOps platform for Azure is hopefully something you are aware of, and actually something you can use outside of Azure as well, and that is GitHub Actions. So we are actually embracing GitHub Actions as the de facto, okay, CI/CD solution for Azure as well as outside of Azure, right? So you could be using Azure GitHub Actions even for all your on-premise workloads, if that's what you want to do. Similarly, yes, ma'am? Yeah. I didn't hear the last part, ma'am. It depends. So there's a couple of, usually for things like App Service and all of our managed service offerings, there's a couple of tiers of support. Okay, so at the basic tier, yes, it's basically following the serverless model where you pay for what you actually use. But for large-scale enterprise customers, that model usually does not make sense, right? So if you're using something with higher frequency, typically there's a dedicated plan, right? So where you dedicate specific capacity. I don't know the exact details of it yet, but I would be very surprised if that was not the case for Cosmos DB. Either way, you can grab a card for me later on, and maybe send me an email. I can get you in touch with the right person inside of Microsoft that can definitively answer that question for you. But I would frankly be very surprised if there was not an option that says, hey, I really want this much dedicated compute capacity. I'll just pay for it upfront, and that's the price I pay. Okay. Egress and ingress, so you're paying by, okay. And you have dedicated capacity for that, probably. Yeah. Okay, so App Insights is really our answer to ELK. Okay, so if you're doing sort of ELK stack and your primary concern is log consolidation and monitoring, so the primary answers for that in an Azure native way, and that supports Java as much as it can, okay, and it's evolving, and we need your input on all of that. But we hope that we're actually already on par with something like ELK, and that is App Insights and Azure Monitor, okay. Similarly, we have different solutions for storage, like blob storage or Azure Files, Key Vault for secure information, Azure Active Directory. Obviously, you probably are all aware of Azure Active Directory already. It's a way of basically a directory server. And we also have different messaging platforms as well that are again managed services, native to Azure. So these examples are things like Azure Service Bus, Event Hub, and Event Grid. Now, let's decouple for that for a second and take a look at this picture from a more holistic level. For each of these things, as you can probably clearly see, most of these are not native Java implemented. Okay, majority of these are, just a moment, sir, are implemented using C or C++ or C# or what have you. But the key thing to understand for Java is that doesn't actually matter, because for each of these services, we provide Java bindings. Okay, so there's generally 3 flavors of Java bindings, whatever service you're talking about here. Let's take a look at Service Bus as a canonical example. So for Service Bus, we give you first and foremost a Java SC API. Okay, so it's a proprietary API, but it is a Java API that you can use to do messaging with Service Bus, and that will give you basically the richest number of features that you can get out of Service Bus. However, Service Bus also supports JMS as a protocol. Okay, so you could be speaking to Azure Service Bus using the JMS protocol, and let's say you're using Spring. Okay, so you're using Spring Boot. We even go so far as to provide you starters. Okay, so you can literally go take a look at it and say Azure Service Bus Spring Boot Starter, and that is yet another flavor. So where it is possible, we are also providing you Spring bindings or Spring-based APIs for all of these services. So Java SE, where possible, standards-based Jakarta E API bindings as well as Spring bindings. Yes, sir. So yes and no. There's many different ways you could do Service Bus integration, right? So there's the lowest common denominator, of course, is doing at the app layer, right? So whatever translation you're doing, whatever your input and output source is, read it from that source. Let's say read it from the database, and then use the corresponding Java APIs to move data from one place to the other. However, in many different cases, Azure Service Bus also has native integrations built into it as well. In fact, I'll talk about, in a moment, we'll talk about logic apps. Okay, logic apps is one of the things you can do to do these kind of glue bindings, right? To say, oh, I want to really connect from Azure Service Bus to, let's say, my Azure Blob Storage. Okay, you can do that in a declarative way rather than doing it in programmatic way, but not for every situation, obviously, right? So there's some well-known integrations that are there. Anything beyond that, you're right. Basically, you're going to do that at the app layer. So I need to understand that problem in a little bit more detail. I couldn't tell you an answer. I don't understand the problem right away. So maybe let's take that offline. Again, you can have. I'll be happy to give you a business card, and maybe we can figure out what the problem is offline. But in general, if there's an issue, let us know. Right? We're here to solve these kind of issues with Java developers, and in fact for customers in general. But definitely in my case for Java developers, we want to make sure that all of these things. If there's an issue, if there's a bug, if something is not working as expected, that's my job, right? That you please bring that to my attention, and I'll figure out what's going on and try to solve it on your behalf. Okay, so let's talk about sort of our newest service offering, and perhaps for some people a rather interesting one, and that is Azure Spring Cloud. Okay, so just like we have in App Service, we support Java SE, Tomcat, and JBoss EAP. This is a bit more of a specialized service. Okay, so this service is geared towards sort of the creme de la creme of Spring developers, if you will. Right. So if you're a Spring developer and you're developing dozens of microservices, and you have a need for Spring Cloud services, so things like, let's say, circuit breaker dashboard, or API gateway, or config dashboard, or service registry, or distributed tracing, all of these are basically components in Spring Cloud. Well, this is the service for you. Okay, so basically this allows you to use, first and foremost, be able to deploy your Spring Boot services, and as many services as you would like, with all of the complexities of the deployment taken away from you, plus all of the Spring Cloud services that you would use, all of these component services, they're baked into this. Okay, so there are sort of mini services running within this larger service that you can simply reference. Okay, you can simply assume that they are running there. Of course, aside from that, you can use the rest of the Azure ecosystem, right? So whatever you need above and beyond that, database, messaging platform, same story applies, right? So you can integrate with whatever it is that you need from within Azure Spring Cloud. All right, now let's talk about serverless. Serverless, it does have some adoption on Azure. I wouldn't say that it has as big of an adoption as the rest of our platform offerings, but it does have some specific use cases where serverless absolutely makes sense. So in case you don't know what serverless is basically functions as a service. For us old school guys and gals, this is basically CGI on steroids. Okay, so what you do here is you say, hey, I want to run this bit of code. It's not an application. I just want to run this code. I don't want to do any deployments. Tell me how you can run this code the fastest way possible, and take care of all of the provisioning concerns and scaling concerns and even billing concerns for me. So just bill me with whatever it is, however many times that I invoke this piece of code. So of course we support serverless on Azure. So our serverless platform is called Azure Functions. Okay, and Azure Functions has first-class support for Java. So what this means is these code snippets that you'll be deploying, they can be written in Java. And we also have some Java bindings for these things as well. The other thing that we should talk about in this context is logic apps. Okay, so logic apps is basically a serverless take on ESB. All right, so let's talk about all of those integration concerns of I want to move data from point A to point B, do this little bit of a translation for me, or depending on how this data looks like, route it to this place or that place or that place. All of those enterprise integration patterns, those are actually baked in a way that makes sense in a serverless world. Okay, so if you think of it in this way, this is an ESB-like thing that can talk functions. Okay, so its input can be functions and its output can be a function invocation. Okay, so that's what logic apps actually is. It's like a low-code platform, if you will. So basically, it's a way of developing applications, that's more declarative rather than empirical in style. Okay, so we talked about the fact that while we are focusing on Azure, we do look beyond Azure to some extent as well, right? So we are. It makes sense when you're doing this much investment in Java for some of that investment to sort of bleed out in an organic way into the ecosystem. So a really good example of that is the Microsoft build of OpenJDK. Now this is something, again, 5 years ago, if somebody told me that Microsoft was going to produce a distributor, a free one, right, that provides LTS, long-term support, right, 10-year support for your Java versions, I wouldn't believe you. I said, this is you're dreaming. It's not going to happen. But here it is. This is where we are. There is, in fact, a free LTS distribution from Microsoft that is available. One little caveat: it does not support Java SE 8. Okay, so it supports Java SE 11 and up. Okay, and it is supported not through sort of us. So we're not kind of doing our own little thing in a dark corner somewhere. We choose to do this through an open platform. Okay, so the open platform we use to deliver our OpenJDK distribution is actually Eclipse Adoptium. Okay, so you actually, in order to download this, you ultimately go to Eclipse Adoptium to download the Microsoft distribution of the JDK. And by the way, we do use this JDK internally ourselves. Okay, so first and foremost, we use it obviously in Azure. So yeah, so when we're talking about spinning up Java SE instances on app service, or when we're talking about Java bindings in serverless, well, ultimately the JDK that is using is the same OpenJDK that we are making available to you. And you may not know this, but Microsoft actually has a decent Java footprint as well. The reason for this is LinkedIn. Okay, so I don't know how many of you know this, but obviously Microsoft has purchased LinkedIn. LinkedIn is one of the largest Java deployments in the world, and obviously they need a JDK, and guess what JDK that they're using, right? So same thing for Minecraft. So there's a number of places where we sort of embed Java, okay, and many of these are, again, things like Minecraft that Microsoft procured, but happens to be Java runtimes. So all of those, we're sort of dog fooding our own OpenJDK distribution as well. So you have some assurances that this is not just some toy that we said, let's produce something. This is actually something we consume and we use for mission critical workloads ourselves. All right. So there's two different, above and beyond all that, there's a couple of different things that we did just for this conference. Okay, I'm being very honest with you here. So please pay attention to these things. If you have somebody that these releases are relevant for, please point them in this direction. The aka links, aka links, is very simple to remember. It's simply these in the pattern of WebSphere, -Azure, or Devnexus, and I'll talk about the next one in just a moment. So what is this? I talked about basically the marketplace solution templates that we are developing for app servers, right? So in this case, it's WebSphere. So we have marketplace solution templates for WebSphere on VMs and OpenLiberty on AKS and ARO. So there's a couple of different things we did just for this conference. We added base instances, so we provide support for WebSphere ND, which is the WebSphere clustering solution. But we have also now added support for just single instance deployments using WebSphere base, and that is baked into our solution templates. We have also added evaluation licenses. Okay, so WebSphere, as you know, is a commercial product. You need entitlements, and we check entitlements on these solution templates. But in addition to that, we are also providing support for evaluation licenses. The other thing we're doing is that for our Liberty on AKS and ARO offerings, we added a little option to make it even easier for you to get started. Let's say you want to get started with Liberty on ARO or Liberty on AKS and you don't have an application. Okay, so the way you can do this is we have added an option in the marketplace solution template that you can simply check to say, hey, just use an example application for me, and we will actually deploy that example application for you automatically. The second thing I want to point out, and again, if this is relevant to you, please do spread the word. That is aka.ms, JBoss, app service, and cluster Devnexus, and I'll actually upload these slide decks. You can find this slide deck on Speaker Deck. Okay, so just search for this. I think you'll land on it. You'll land on a Speaker Deck page, my Speaker Deck page, and I'll make sure that these slides are up there, okay, for you to take a look at. So you don't have to remember these URLs necessarily. Just a moment, sir. So you can please take a look at these and obviously reach out to us, especially with regards to the JBoss app service feature. So I'll explain this feature in really quick because I'm running a little bit short of time also, and there's a few other things that I did want to show you. So we've been supporting actually the JBoss CAPN app service for a little while now, right? So, but the way we supported it so far is in a stateless way, okay, which is what actually makes sense in a lot of cloud applications. But the feedback that we've received is that certain customers actually want the old school clustering stateful feature within JBoss CAPN app service. So in order to facilitate those customers, we have now added that capability. So now you can actually run clustered stateful workloads on JBoss CAPN app service. It is in preview right now, okay, and preview honestly is a really good time for you to engage and try things out, because the product development team is wanting to work with you, okay, and get your feedback on what you would want from this particular feature. So if this is something you're looking into, this is honestly a really good time to engage with us on it. Moving forward, I do want to talk a little bit about tooling, but not too much. I think I have about 10 more minutes to go. But since we did Q&A, I do want to take advantage of the 10 minutes. Somebody had a question, and I said I was going to get back to them. Yes, sir. I'll be very honest with you, the demand is rather modest, right? So yeah, depending on how, we really have big 5 languages that we support on Azure bona fide, right? So and we make every effort to make sure that that's runs well. You can imagine what those are. So it's basically C#, JavaScript, Python, Node, and Java, right? So aside from that, you can run anything that you want, right? It's just we don't really offer you such nice white glove attention, if you will. But things change, right? So if we see that there's, let's say, significant demand for Kotlin, yeah, we could do something along those lines, but not at the moment. Okay. All right, so let's talk about tools for a second in the remaining 10 minutes or so that I have. And by the way, we can continue the conversation either on the hallway or here after the next 10 minutes are done, if you will. So one of the key things that Microsoft does well is tooling. Okay, so if you have a nice friendly argument with your nice neighborhood C# guy, the thing that they will tell you is that Java is great and has got a great ecosystem, but the reason I'm using C# is because of Visual Studio. Okay, so that is actually a true statement, is that Microsoft is very, very good at producing tooling. However, now that we are actually mostly also a Java shop, we're also doing our part to make sure the tooling story for Azure in particular for Java is actually just as strong, right? So we know that that while it's not as fancy as Visual Studio Code, the Java developers are also tools heavy folks, right, and have been for some period of time. So if you're developing Java, you likely are not doing just Java SE, right? I hope not, right? So you're probably using something like Maven or Jenkins or Terraform or GitHub Actions and the like, right? So whatever your tooling chain is, we want to make sure that you are well served. So typically the way we do this is we take a look at each of these ecosystems and say, hey, where can we develop plugins? Can we have Maven plugins to deploy into AKS? And yes, we need this and we do it, right? So this is in general how we support the tooling ecosystem in Java. Plus, we have this really interesting thing called Azure SDK, and I'll explain in a moment what this is. Azure SDK is basically an SPI for Azure. Okay, so anything that you would do on Azure, deploying a new VM, deploying a new AKS cluster, deploying a new database, deploying a new instance of Spring Cloud Service, fundamentally at the very lowest common denominator, that is done through this thing called Azure SDK. Okay, so all of these things like the portal, the CLI, ARM templates, Bicep, all of these things ultimately translate down to Azure SDK calls. Okay, so this Azure SDK actually does support Java. Okay, believe it or not. So if you're a tool developer, okay, and you're wanting to do tight integration with Azure, you can do that using Java as the language. Okay, so you can understand basically we're at the lowest common denominator level. We're even supporting Java in terms of Azure. Now, of course, again, we know that Java developers are also IDE developers as well. It's highly unlikely these days you'll run into a Java developer that's developing on VI or Emacs. Bless their heart if there is such people. But majority are developing in an IDE, right? So we are in the IDE space, and we're meeting developers where they are here also. So again, we're developing Azure plugins, right, for IntelliJ. There are some capabilities in Eclipse as well to ensure that if you happen to be using these IDEs, you can still use Azure in an effective way. Now, one of the most interesting things that I won't have very much time to show you today, but I will try, see if there's enough time for it, is actually that we actually sort of have an IDE solution of our own as well. Okay, So this is Visual Studio Code, right? I hope some of you have heard of it. And in Visual Studio Code, we've made it a primary objective to support Java developers. Okay, so I wouldn't say that you can use Visual Studio Code as a replacement for IntelliJ, but it sure is pretty interesting, right? So even myself, when I'm developing new projects, I at least start with Visual Studio Code and see how far I can get, and I can get pretty far. Okay, so this is another thing for you to consider, and this is, think of it again sort of as an investment of Azure Plus, right? So Azure, while we're doing things to make things easier on Azure, ultimately it results in things that we produce for the ecosystem as well. Okay, so I'm going to wrap all of this up by, I covered quite a bit of ground. I'm going to just show you some quick examples to put all of this together. These are going to be sort of solutions inspired by real world. Okay, so I don't want to give away the secret sauce of our customers, but this is some of the things our customers are doing. So let's just suppose you're running a WebLogic workload and you need a 3-node cluster. You can go ahead and create that using the Azure Marketplace solution template. That solution template also will support coherence if you happen to be using coherence. We have a separate solution template that will allow you to create an Oracle database very easily. And then once you have that set up, you can set up a app gateway instance. And by the way, the solution template supports app gateway integration by default. And you could also be dumping out your log into something like Elastic. And we have managed services for Elastic provided by Elastic Company. It's not Azure native, but still a managed service. You could be doing your deployments through Maven plugins, triggered by Jenkins, again running on Azure virtual machines, triggered by GitHub, and perhaps using Eclipse as your IDE. Here's another example. Let's say you are developing on Kubernetes. You used to be a WebSphere traditional shop. Now you're moving into a more cloud-native space using WebSphere Liberty, and you're deploying WebSphere Liberty on Azure Kubernetes Service. Well, again, you can use our solution templates co-developed with IBM to do this. And again, you could be talking about, you can put on an app gateway in front of it, and the solution template will support that. And you can, after that, integrate with all kinds of Azure services, whether there's managed databases or managed Redis, or App Insights or Azure Active Directory. Ultimately, doing your deployment through Azure Container Registry, maybe in this case through GitHub Actions, again triggered by GitHub and using IntelliJ as your IDE. And believe it or not, this is a real world actually example from one of our customers. Similarly, let's say you are developing a JBoss CAP on app service. Okay, you have a Java EE application, you're deploying that. You can be deploying any number of JBoss instances that you like. You can form a cluster, put Traffic Manager in front of it to do cross-region failover, and again integrate with a bunch of different Azure services. Use Maven for deployments, and we have Maven plugins for app service. Okay, that will allow you to do all of those things. Spring Cloud Service, another Spring Cloud Service deployment. You can be developing dozens of Spring Boot applications, being deployed from GitHub Actions, using IntelliJ as an IDE, and again using a bunch of Azure services. Somebody asked me about doing integration with serverless. So here's an example of that. So let's say you have 3 different serverless functions that you have deployed. They're all listening to blob storage ultimately, but they do slightly different things. Well, you can do that intelligent routing using logic apps, okay, to route to the specific app functions instance that you would like. And those functions instances, in a declarative fashion, could be supporting dumping out to Cosmos DB, dumping out to Service Bus, or even maybe sending a SMS message using Twilio. And this is all declarative programming in the serverless realm. It's not actually code you write. It's mostly like configuration. Okay. Ultimately, you could be reading some of this data in a web app, perhaps deployed in an app service. Okay, so I definitely do not have time to do a demo. I literally have 5 minutes. We will see if I can do a demo or not. But let me tell you, the demo is actually something you can do yourself. Okay, so if this talk makes you curious about how Java development on Azure looks like, I've created a sample application, a sample end-to-end application for you. And this application is actually on GitHub. It's in this URL that you can look up when I post the slide deck. So let me show you how the application looks like, or rather how the GitHub repo looks like. So here's a GitHub repository, and it will take you step by step. okay? In taking a representative application, in this case, the application is going to be Wildfly running on Azure Kubernetes Service, and it is going to be using a whole bunch of Azure services. So there's instructions for how you set up your environment. There's instructions on how you create a managed Postgres database. There's step-by-step instructions on how to use application insights as your logging, as your aggregate log solution. We're using Azure Cache for Redis in this example. And then how you run this example in your IDE using Visual Studio Code, okay? And finally, setting up a Kubernetes cluster and actually doing the Kubernetes deployment of this application, okay? So if there is time, I will show you the application, but take a look at this. If the talk today piques your interest and you want to find out how does Azure looks like, how does it compare, for example, with your development experience today, you can very easily take a look at this GitHub repo. It'll take you probably about 4 to 5 hours to set this up, okay? But you'll get a real first-hand close look at how Java development experience looks like on the Azure platform. So to wrap this up, given that I have about 3 minutes, okay? Microsoft is very serious about Java, okay? I don't know how much I need to tell you this. Hopefully it is blatantly obvious from all of the work that we have done and continue to do on behalf of Java developers. So take us seriously, engage with us, and tell us what it is that you want from us. One of the reasons I'm here and the Microsoft Azure team is here in the booth downstairs is to engage with you, okay? So please take opportunity to engage with us and let us know what it is that you want. We are here to serve you, right? We are here to make sure you are successful with your Java workloads on a first-class public cloud. There are many different pathways. We talked about all of them. There are many different architecture choices. We are not very opinionated about what your choices are. We are in the business of enabling you, whatever your choices may be, and wherever you may be in your journey. You can choose virtual machines, container, managed services, serverless, or anything in between, or all of the above. We do provide you tooling, okay? So we above and beyond just what we provide for Azure, we do provide the OpenJDK, we do provide Visual Studio Code, and those are things you can engage with us as well. And this is an evolving story, right? So this is not the end of the story by any means. Java on Azure is still relatively young, okay? So and Java is also, I believe, relatively young at heart. It may not be entirely young, but young at heart. But this story will continue, and you can be part of that story, right? We are waiting for you to be part of the story with us. So please do engage with us. There are some resources that I'll leave for you. These are good, aside from the GitHub repo that I shared with you, these are some good resources to get started on your Java and Azure journey. And of course, please do visit our booth downstairs and do engage with us. We're there pretty much all day. I'll be there definitely almost all day tomorrow. So we are very happy to hear from you. So that is all the time I have. I do want to respect people's time. I don't want to abuse your time, so I'm going to skip the demo. Okay, if you want to take a look at the demo, you're curious about it, come to the booth tomorrow. It's been a long day for me, so I'm going to go back to my hotel room and get some sleep or catch a nap. But tomorrow, if you want curious to look at the demo, come to the booth and I'll show you. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.